At 7:11 a.m., on a chilling morning, the world learned of a nightmare that had been unfolding behind closed doors for years. A phone call, calm yet terrifying, left a community shaken and asking the same haunting question: how far could someone go to protect their darkest secret? It was a phone call that would change everything. At precisely 7:11 a.m., the 911 dispatcher answered the call. A teenage girl, barely able to speak, said only one sentence: "My father is dead." Her voice was cold, almost too calm for someone calling about the death of a loved one. There was no panic, no sobbing, just a disturbing, eerie calmness that immediately struck the dispatcher as unusual. Sasha Johnson, a 17-year-old girl, had just lost her father, but it was far more complicated than that. When the officers arrived at the motel, they were prepared for the usual scene of chaos: an argument turned fatal, a robbery gone wrong. But what they found was far from typical. Inside, there was no bloodshed in sight, no signs of forced entry. A man lay dead on the floor, and a teenage girl sitting silently on the bed was the only one there. As detectives began their investigation, they soon realized that this was no ordinary case of sudden death. The girl's presence in the room wasn't merely that of a terrified daughter. It was the key to unraveling a nightmare that had been years in the making. The man on the floor was Pastor Elijah Johnson, a well-respected figure in his church community and in Henry County, Georgia. To the outside world, Elijah was the perfect pastor, a charismatic leader who commanded the pulpit every Sunday, a man of faith with an unwavering moral compass. His family, the picture of an ideal, God-fearing household, was admired by everyone. But behind the scenes, a different reality was unfolding. As officers began their questioning, they couldn't get past the strangest part of the entire situation: Sasha's composure. The girl who should have been devastated by the death of her father was eerily detached. She refused to explain what had happened, her silence heavy with meaning. A few hours later, when she finally did speak, her words would send shockwaves through the investigation. "He killed them. He killed my mom, my brother, my sister, my aunt." Sasha's confession set the stage for what was about to be a long, painful journey for investigators. A journey that would reveal the horrifying truth behind the death of Pastor Elijah Johnson. In that quiet motel room, it became clear that this wasn't just a murder. It was a story of betrayal, manipulation, and the darkest secrets imaginable. But what drove Sasha to the breaking point? Was it pure survival, or had revenge taken root in her heart after years of abuse? The investigation was only beginning, and with every piece of the puzzle they uncovered, the truth became harder to swallow. The Johnsons were the family everyone envied, a beacon of faith, a model of righteousness, but no one knew the darkness that was festering behind their polished smiles, and the picture-perfect lives they displayed for the world. What happened when the mask finally came off? From the outside, the Johnson family was everything a small-town community could ask for. Pastor Elijah Johnson stood at the pulpit every Sunday, commanding attention with his deep voice, dressed impeccably, always poised, always in control. He wasn't just a preacher, he was the embodiment of strength and virtue. His wife, Teresa, was equally admired, a school teacher with an angelic demeanor, known for her gentle ways and quiet strength. Together they raised 3 children: Sasha 17, Marcus 15, and Amara 9. They also had Naya, Teresa's younger sister, living with them after a difficult divorce. Their family life seemed perfect, like something straight out of a church bulletin or a holiday card. They were the kind of family others aspired to be. Everyone in Henry County knew the Johnsons. They were the ones who always showed up, always smiling, and always helping. Their image was untouchable, but appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the pristine surface, a different story was unfolding. Sasha, the quiet and reserved teenage daughter, had always kept to herself. Her drawings in the back of the church, the way she helped with the toddlers during Sunday service, these were the things she was known for. To her friends, Sasha was just a shy, introspective teenager. But there was a subtle shift in her behavior that no one truly understood. It wasn't until late 2022, when Sasha was just 15, that things began to change. Her father, Pastor Elijah, had started offering mentorship sessions to her. He would invite her into his study after Wednesday night Bible study, telling her that he was guiding her in her walk with God, that he saw greatness in her. At first it seemed harmless. After all, what father wouldn't want to mentor his daughter? But the nature of these sessions began to raise concerns. Naya, the aunt living with the family, began to notice subtle changes in Sasha. The once vibrant, playful girl had become withdrawn, quiet, almost paralyzed with fear. Naya saw her niece avoiding eye contact with Elijah and jumping when he entered a room. Sasha had always been quiet, but this was different. There was a weight to her silence now. One evening, Naya witnessed a moment that stopped her in her tracks. After church, she saw Elijah hug Sasha, but this wasn't the casual embrace of a father and daughter. His hand lingered a second too long on her back, and Sasha looked frozen, her eyes distant. When the hug ended, Sasha said nothing and quickly walked away. Nia's instincts kicked in, and she felt a sickening certainty that something was wrong, but she couldn't put it into words. Despite her suspicions, Naya hesitated. She was the outsider in the household, and it wasn't her place to accuse Elijah of anything, especially when his public persona was that of a devout pastor. But as days went by, the unease grew. Sasha had started locking her door, stopped drawing, stopped speaking to her family, and even stopped eating. It was as if she was carrying some unspoken burden that no one could understand. Meanwhile, Elijah remained the perfect father in everyone's eyes. He explained Sasha's strange behavior away as hormonal, typical teenage rebellion. To Teresa, his wife, it all seemed normal. She just needs time, he would reassure her, embracing her with gentle words and comforting her when she questioned Sasha's behavior. But the cracks in the family's flawless facade were growing wider, and the lies were beginning to take shape. Sasha was spiraling deeper into her silence, unable to voice the fear that had taken root in her. And all the while, Elijah continued his manipulative behavior, calling their private encounters spiritual intimacy, and justifying his actions with twisted words about divine purpose. To everyone around him, he was still the model pastor, the moral compass of their community. But at home, he was something entirely different. How does a father become a predator? When does a pastor's guidance cross the line into something far more sinister? The horror of what Pastor Elijah Johnson did behind closed doors became impossible to ignore, and the consequences were deadly. By early 2024, Sasha was no longer the girl anyone remembered. Her bright eyes had become dull and distant. The cheerfulness that once characterized her spirit had vanished, replaced with a deep, suffocating sadness. She barely spoke, even to her family. The once innocent drawings she had used to fill her sketchbook were gone. She spent most of her time hiding in her room, locking the door, and withdrawing from everyone. Her mother, Teresa, had begun to notice the changes, but she couldn't connect the dots. Sasha had always been a quiet child, and at first she blamed the behavior on the pressures of school, or the hormonal changes of adolescence. But the signs became too hard to ignore. Sasha was losing weight, her stomach visibly bloated, and there were whispers of her skipping meals. Her clothes no longer fit her, and she always wore baggy hoodies, even in warmer weather. It wasn't until one day in early 2024 that the truth began to emerge. Teresa found something that left her frozen in place. Her daughter was pregnant. Sasha's reaction to the discovery said more than words could ever express. The silence that followed the discovery was deafening. When Teresa confronted her, her heart sank. The words she spoke were the last thing any mother could ever prepare herself for. It's his. Sasha's father, Pastor Elijah, had been the one to get her pregnant. A surge of anger, disbelief, and confusion swept over Teresa as she processed what her daughter had just said. Who could do such a thing? How had this happened right under her nose? Her mind raced with questions, but the answer was simple: her husband. The man she had trusted to guide and protect their family. The man who stood before their congregation every Sunday, preaching about God's grace and righteousness. Teresa confronted Elijah, but he played the part of the shocked, disappointed father to perfection. "Who is the boy?" he asked loudly, his voice dripping with feigned outrage. But when Sasha refused to name anyone, his anger quickly shifted. "You're pregnant," he demanded, his tone cold and calculating. The conversation turned to manipulation. Elijah accused Sasha of rebellion and lied about the true nature of their relationship, casting blame on anyone other than himself. "She's just moody, hormones, typical teenage behavior," he told Teresa. The mother felt a cold chill run down her spine as she looked at her husband, her once trusted partner in life and faith, who was now treating this monstrous revelation as if it was some trivial matter. Sasha's mind was a prison. There was no escaping what her father had done to her, and every time she tried to speak up, Elijah's manipulation stifled her voice. He made it clear that his control over her was absolute. He justified his actions by claiming that what they shared was sacred, that he had been chosen to guide her in ways that no one else could understand. He even began speaking of a future together, telling Sasha that when she turned 18, they would be free to leave, to start a new life, and to be married. At this point, the horror was undeniable. Sasha felt trapped in her own body, terrified of the man who had once been a pillar of trust. She couldn't escape him, and she couldn't speak up. The weight of her shame and confusion bore down on her, suffocating her every move. But while Sasha's voice was silenced, Marcus, her younger brother, was beginning to piece together the truth. He overheard a conversation between Sasha and Elijah late one night, and what he heard shook him to his core. His father, the man who had always been the symbol of strength in their family, was the cause of the sickness that had overtaken their home. Marcus knew something was wrong, but when he heard his father's cold, controlled voice and Sasha's terrified whispers, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The truth was horrifying, but it was undeniable. Marcus was no longer the naive child who believed in his father's perfect image. He knew that his family was being destroyed from within, but he was powerless to stop it. And as the pressure mounted on Sasha, she began to withdraw even further, her body and mind breaking under the weight of her father's control. This was a family on the brink of collapse, and soon it would be shattered forever. When a family is broken from the inside, can any act of justice truly repair the damage? In the quiet of the Johnson household, one man's twisted sense of control would lead to the ultimate destruction, a cold and calculated murder that no one saw coming. Elijah Johnson's world was falling apart. The walls he had carefully built, the facade of the perfect family, were crumbling. His secret was slipping through his fingers, and everyone who had once trusted him was now beginning to see the cracks in his carefully constructed image. His wife, Teresa, was no longer speaking to him, her silence more deafening than any confrontation could be. Nia, the aunt, was watching him with disgust and fear in her eyes. Even Marcus, the ever-energetic 15-year-old, was acting strangely, his jovial nature gone. But the one person who still feared him, who still looked to him for some semblance of protection, was Sasha. Despite the twisted nature of their relationship, she was still his daughter, and in his mind, that gave him power over her. Elijah wasn't just going to let his world fall apart. He had spent years building a reputation, building a family that others admired, and now it was all on the verge of collapsing. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, the truth would tear everything away from him. His church, his position, his family, everything he had worked so hard for,
would be lost. It was at this moment that Elijah made a horrifying decision. He couldn't afford to let anyone talk. If they did, they'd ruin him. And the one person who had the power to destroy him was Sasha. She was the key. The one who knew everything. In a terrifying fit of control and rage, Elijah decided that the only way to protect his reputation and maintain his control was to erase everyone who knew the truth. He knew that he couldn't let them live. There was no room for failure, no room for mercy. His twisted love for Sasha had grown into an obsession, and the only way he could start anew, without the weight of his crimes hanging over him, was to eliminate those who would expose him. Friday, April 12, 2024, was the night Elijah chose. He had carefully planned everything. The house was quiet, everyone was home, the perfect moment to carry out his brutal scheme. His victims wouldn't have a chance to fight back. Elijah had thought of everything, the timing, the location, the method. Nothing could go wrong. He began with Marcus, his 15-year-old son. Marcus had always been a light-hearted, energetic kid. But that night, he lay asleep in his room, unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. Elijah, dressed in black, moved silently through the house, his Glock 19 in hand. He approached Marcus's room, the door creaking open just enough for him to slip inside. Marcus was curled up on his bed, headphones still in, his body relaxed in sleep. With a cold, calculated motion, Elijah raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The shot was quick, silent, just a single pulse of violence that ended Marcus's life in an instant. His son, who had once idolized him, never woke up. Next was Amara, his youngest daughter, just 9 years old. She had always been a ball of energy, vibrant, full of life. Elijah knew she would be a light sleeper, so he was careful. He stepped into her room, the moonlight casting long shadows on the walls. Amara blinked awake, rubbing her eyes, as she saw her father standing over her. "Daddy," she said sleepily. Elijah hesitated for just a moment, staring at his innocent daughter. But that hesitation was brief. Without another word, he raised the gun and shot her point blank in her bed. The only sound was the soft click of the trigger, followed by Amara's body slumping back onto the pillow. The music box on her dresser continued to spin, a haunting reminder of the innocence lost in that room. Downstairs, Nia had been unable to sleep. Something felt wrong, the air heavy with a sense of dread. She heard the creak of footsteps above her, and then a thud. She froze. Something wasn't right. The sound of slow, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. She quickly reached for the drawer, where she kept a knife, but before she could react, Elijah appeared in the doorway, gun in hand. "What the hell are you doing?" Nia demanded, her voice shaking with both fear and confusion. Elijah didn't answer. With no hesitation, he shot her twice, once in the chest, once in the lower abdomen. She stumbled back toward the fridge before collapsing to the floor, gasping for breath. She barely managed to reach the back door before she fell still. Finally, Teresa, Elijah's wife, sat alone in their bedroom, awaiting the inevitable confrontation. She had known what was coming. She could feel it in the air. Her husband was no longer the man she had once loved, the man she had trusted, the man who had stood at the pulpit every Sunday. But there was no escape now. She looked up at him, not with fear, but with an icy fury. "Elijah, please," she began, her voice trembling, but Elijah didn't let her finish. With one swift motion, he raised the gun and shot her in the chest. Teresa collapsed to the floor, her Bible slipping from her hands. Her body crumpled, lifeless, as the blood pooled around her on the rug they had bought together. The house was silent once again. The final step was Sasha. She had been the one he had kept closest, the one who had become his obsession. He had promised her they would start over, that they would be free. But freedom to Elijah meant one thing: total control. As he entered her room, Sasha stirred in her sleep, unaware of the fate that awaited her. But when she saw him standing there, gun in hand, her body froze. Elijah didn't shoot her, not yet. He lowered the weapon, his breathing heavy, and sat beside her on the bed. "We can start over," he whispered. "We can leave this all behind. You and me, we can get married." Sasha didn't speak. She didn't move. In that moment, she realized that her father, the man she had trusted, the man she had once looked up to, was gone. What remained was a monster. And the worst part, she had no choice but to endure. Could a daughter ever truly escape her father's grasp, after years of manipulation and abuse? In the darkest moment of her life, Sasha faced the unthinkable: survival, revenge, or something far more devastating. The choice would change everything. Sasha's heart pounded in her chest as she lay there in her room, staring at her father, the man who had once been the center of her life. Elijah's words echoed in her mind. "We can start over. You and me, we can leave this behind. We can be free." But freedom wasn't what he was offering. It wasn't freedom to live and love. It was the freedom to be trapped forever, alone with him. The man she once called father, the man she had trusted, was now the monster who had killed her entire family, and she had no idea where to turn. She stared at him, paralyzed by fear. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. She couldn't breathe. There was a part of her that wanted to scream, to fight back, but another part was terrified. She had seen what her father was capable of, and she knew what would happen if she resisted. But in that silence, something inside Sasha clicked. A surge of determination pushed through the fog of fear. For so long she had been silent, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. But now there was one thing left to do: take control of her own fate. She didn't speak a word, but her mind raced, calculating her next move. She stood up slowly, almost mechanically, as if her body was moving without her permission. Elijah watched her carefully, his eyes filled with a twisted sense of hope. He thought that somehow they could still have a future together, that he could still manipulate her, control her. But Sasha's silence spoke volumes. She moved quietly toward the bathroom, her hands trembling as she opened the cabinet under the sink. In the back corner, she saw what she was looking for: Noya's orange prescription bottle. Noya had told her about the pills before, how they helped her sleep, but left her feeling groggy and disconnected. Sasha didn't think twice. She grabbed the bottle, slipped it into her pocket, and returned to the room. Elijah was still sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her, his gun resting next to him on the nightstand. "What are you doing, Sasha?" he asked, his voice soft, as if this were just another of their secret meetings. She didn't answer. She knew there was no use in speaking. He wouldn't understand, not now. He didn't want to understand. Sasha sat down on the bed, her hands still shaking, but in her mind, she was already making her escape. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to be the one to kill her father, but she knew what would happen if she didn't act. There was no room for kindness, no room for weakness anymore. She had to survive, for what was left of her family, for the piece of her soul that had been suffocated by years of manipulation and abuse. Sasha crushed the pills, the small white tablets crumbling into dust beneath her fingers. The powder fell into the soup she had bought for her father earlier that morning. Elijah had been so sure of his control over her. He had no idea that the very thing he thought was his victory, his last attempt to manipulate her into his twisted future, was the same thing that would bring about his downfall. She stirred the soup carefully, making sure the powder dissolved, and then with a calmness she didn't feel, she returned to the bed. Elijah looked up at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're starting to understand, Sasha," he said, his voice dripping with pride. She handed him the bowl, and he took it eagerly. "This is how it was always meant to be," he murmured, taking a spoonful of the soup. Sasha didn't move, didn't speak, she just watched. She had already made her decision, and there was no turning back now. As the minutes passed, the effects of the drug began to take hold. Elijah's smile faltered, his eyes starting to lose focus. His words became slurred, and his movements grew sluggish. At first he tried to speak, but the words didn't come out right. He stumbled to his feet, swaying as he tried to steady himself. Sasha didn't look away. Her father, the man who had tormented her for so long, was collapsing in front of her, his body betraying him in the most brutal way. He reached for her, his hand trembling as he tried to speak her name. Sasha. His voice was weak, desperate, but she stepped back, watching him fall apart. She had never wanted this, but it was the only way to escape. She had lived in fear for so long, trapped by the man who should have protected her, and now she had the power to take back what he had stolen from her. As Elijah's body hit the floor, his breath coming in short, labored gasps, Sasha remained still. The man who had once ruled her life, the man who had destroyed everything, was now helpless. She watched him until he was no longer moving, his body curled on the cold motel floor. The silence that filled the room was deafening, but Sasha didn't flinch. She was numb, but in the strangest way, she felt free. The next morning, when the sun was barely up, Sasha picked up the motel phone and dialed 911. "My father is dead," she said, in a voice that was so calm, it sent chills down the dispatcher's spine. The words fell from her lips with an eerie detachment, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life.
When the police arrived, they found the motel room as quiet as it had been the night before. No signs of a struggle, no chaos, just a dead man on the floor and a teenage girl sitting on the bed, staring ahead. The authorities were left with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: Sasha had survived, and now her journey was just beginning. The truth has a way of coming out, even when the darkest of secrets are buried deep. What happened next would shatter everything. The community thought they knew about the Johnsons, and leave them questioning the very foundation of trust. The investigation into Elijah Johnson's death was as disturbing as it was confusing. When officers arrived at the motel and found Sasha sitting silently next to her father's lifeless body, they immediately suspected foul play. After all, a young girl alone in a motel room with her dead father was not a typical scenario. But what baffled them more than anything was the utter calmness in Sasha's demeanor. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, she was eerily composed, almost detached from the gravity of the situation. Sasha didn't speak much in the beginning. She was taken in for questioning, sitting alone in a sterile, cold interrogation room. The detectives tried to get answers, but she didn't respond. Hours passed before she finally spoke, and when she did, it was a confession so shocking it sent shockwaves through the investigation. "He killed them. My mom, my brother, my sister, my aunt. He killed them all." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The detectives were stunned. How could this be? Pastor Elijah Johnson, the man who had led his church with conviction and respect, the man who had been a father to his children, had murdered his entire family. The idea seemed unfathomable. But Sasha's matter-of-fact tone and the lack of emotion in her voice made the detectives question everything they thought they knew about the Johnson family. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they began to piece together the horrifying truth. The murders had been carried out with chilling precision. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. It was as if Elijah had carefully planned and executed the deaths of each of his family members, one by one, with the cold detachment of a man who believed he had the right to do so. The police soon discovered the bodies of Marcus, Amara, Naya, and Teresa, each killed in their own room, each shot in the same calculated manner. There was no question about it. The deaths had been intentional. They weren't the result of a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was something far more sinister. A man who had been driven by control, a man who believed he could erase anyone who threatened his twisted version of reality. But the investigation didn't end there. As detectives combed through the family's personal belongings, they discovered a disturbing trail of evidence: messages on Sasha's phone, texts between her and her father, some deleted but recovered,
The texts told a chilling story. Elijah had been grooming Sasha for months, sending messages about their special connection, about how she was chosen. He had been manipulative and coercive, using his position as a father and a pastor to justify his actions and keep Sasha silent. One message in particular sent a shiver down the spine of every investigator. "Soon when you turn 18 we'll leave. We'll be free. You and me. We can start over." It was a twisted promise of a life together, a life built on abuse, manipulation, and control. But Sasha had no intention of living out that dark future. In the days following the discovery, investigators found even more evidence that confirmed Sasha's claims. Marcus's phone held a crucial piece of information, a voice memo that sent a chilling message to the police. The recording was shaky, but it was clear. "Something's wrong with Dad. I think he's the reason Sasha's acting weird. I heard them fighting. I think she's pregnant, and I think it's his." The voice on the recording was unmistakably Marcus's, and it was the final confirmation they needed. The realization that Sasha had been carrying her father's child only added another layer of horror to the case. It wasn't just about the murders anymore. It was about the years of manipulation and abuse that Sasha had endured in silence. The psychological trauma she had been subjected to was beyond comprehension. And yet, despite it all, she had found a way to survive. Despite the horrors she had lived through, Sasha was not viewed as a cold-blooded killer, but a victim of extreme abuse. The police soon learned that the abuse had been ongoing for months, maybe even years, though no one in the community had ever suspected a thing. How could they? Pastor Elijah had always been the perfect image of a man of faith, a devoted husband, and a loving father. To the outside world, the Johnsons were a picture-perfect family, the kind of family everyone aspired to be. But that was all a lie. In the aftermath of the investigation, the truth began to spread like wildfire through Henry County. The once respected pastor, the man who had been entrusted with the souls of his congregation, was now seen for who he truly was: a predator, a manipulator, and a murderer. The community was rocked to its core. People who had known Elijah for years couldn't believe the man they had admired could have been capable of such monstrosities. They had seen him stand at the pulpit, leading with a voice full of authority, but now they were forced to confront the truth. Elijah Johnson was a murderer. For Sasha, the truth didn't bring relief. The world she had known was shattered. Her family was gone, and though she had taken control of her fate, she had paid a tremendous price. As the investigation unfolded, the police and the courts decided that, due to the abuse and manipulation Sasha had suffered at the hands of her father, the murder charges against her would be dropped. It was a painful and complicated decision, but one that recognized the years of trauma she had endured. Sasha was placed into protective custody, removed from the media frenzy and public scrutiny that had followed her story. She was finally safe, but at what cost? The years of abuse and manipulation had left deep scars, and the path to healing would be long and difficult. The world may have seen her as a survivor, but the truth was that no one could ever truly understand the weight of what she had experienced. The community that once revered Pastor Elijah Johnson was left in turmoil. The church closed its doors, its stained glass windows now a symbol of broken trust. The image of the righteous man who had stood behind the pulpit every Sunday was forever tarnished. And for the people of Henry County, there was no going back. They had seen the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface, and they would never forget the story of the Johnsons, the story of a family destroyed by lies, manipulation, and an unimaginable betrayal. In the wake of unimaginable tragedy, can justice ever truly be served? For Sasha, there would be no happy endings, no closure, only survival. And in the aftermath of her father's monstrous acts, she would learn the hardest lesson of all. Survival is not enough. Sasha sat quietly in the sterile room, her fingers tightly gripping the edge of the table. The fluorescent lights above hummed in the background, their incessant buzz the only sound breaking the otherwise suffocating silence. It had been weeks since her father's death, And though she was no longer in physical danger, the emotional toll of her survival weighed heavily on her shoulders. She was in protective custody, far removed from the public eye, but the mental scars left by her years of abuse and the aftermath of her father's murder were impossible to escape. Sasha was now living in a place that was cold and unfamiliar. No reporters, no cameras, just a handful of psychologists who were assigned to help her piece together the fragments of her shattered existence. They were kind, but Sasha couldn't bring herself to trust them. How could she? Trust had been broken too many times before, and the person who had destroyed her world, the man she should have been able to depend on, was gone. It was difficult to comprehend that she had been freed from him in the most final, irreversible way possible. Elijah's death should have been a form of liberation. But Sasha had learned a painful truth. Freedom wasn't as simple as walking away from an abuser. She couldn't leave the memories of her family behind. She couldn't escape the guilt of having survived when they hadn't. The trauma lingered, feeding off her every thought, every moment of stillness. The community that had once revered her father was also left to confront the darkness that had been hidden behind their pastor's public image. Henry County, once so sure of Elijah's righteousness, was now torn apart by the truth. The church which had been his domain was shuttered, and no one showed up for Sunday service anymore. The stained glass windows, which had once symbolized hope and faith, now stood as a mocking reminder of how deep the lies had run. There were whispers in the community. Some tried to defend Elijah's memory, but most couldn't. They couldn't reconcile the image of the man who had preached faith and grace with the man who had secretly manipulated and murdered his own family. The horror of the truth was too much to bear. But for Sasha there was no comfort in the community's grief. No one could truly understand what she had lived through. No one could fix the broken pieces of her soul. And then there were the lingering questions. Was it survival or revenge? Was her decision to poison her father in his final moments an act of justice or an act of deep, desperate retribution? Sasha didn't know. She didn't have the answers, nor did she think she ever would. What she knew was that Elijah had taken everything from her, their family, her innocence, her ability to trust, and in that motel room, when she made the decision to poison him, she had reclaimed something. But it wasn't a victory. It was a hollow, tragic moment of clarity. The man who had destroyed her life was gone, but it didn't make the pain disappear. Now she was left with a future full of unknowns. The law had deemed her actions justifiable, given the years of abuse she had suffered. The charges against her were dropped, and she was placed in protective custody, where she could begin the long process of healing. But healing was not an easy path. It wasn't just about moving forward. It was about accepting the scars that would never fade. In the quiet isolation of her new life, Sasha struggled to make sense of it all. She would never return to the life she had before. The innocent girl she had been before her father's manipulation, before the horror of what he had done to her and her family. She was no longer the same person, and no matter how much time passed, no matter how many therapists tried to help her find peace, some wounds would never heal. What happened to Sasha after that moment in the motel room is something only she will ever fully understand. She was placed into a new identity, protected from the public eye and the media's relentless gaze. She was safe, but safety was not the same as peace. The world outside would move on, forgetting the horror that had unfolded behind closed doors. But for Sasha, the memory of what her father had done would haunt her forever. Her story, no matter how it was framed, was one of survival. She had endured the unimaginable. She had fought back in the only way she knew how, even though it had come at a staggering cost. In the end, she wasn't the hero, nor the villain. She was a survivor, someone who had made it through the darkest moments imaginable, and lived to tell the tale. But there was no fairy tale ending here. No redemption, no restoration, just survival. And the knowledge that sometimes, survival is all we can hope for. As the community continued to rebuild, as the news cycle shifted to the next tragedy, and as people whispered about the Johnson family, Sasha was left in the quiet of her new life, trying to learn how to exist in a world that had turned its back on her. For Sasha, the past would never let her go. And so the story of Pastor Elijah Johnson, and the horror that consumed his family, would echo in the silence of her thoughts, a reminder of what she had endured, and what she had lost.